At Highland Wildlife Park in the Scottish Highlands, there is a Pallas cat named Arya. She is 2 years old, healthy by every clinical measure, and she has not made a single sound in 730 days. Not a growl, not a hiss, not the low churring call that Pallas cats make when they feel safe. Nothing. The keepers have noted it. The veterinarians have examined her. A behavioral researcher spent 3 days observing her and filed a report that used careful, qualified language to say essentially that no one knows why. Pallas cats are not silent animals. They have one of the more varied vocal repertoires among small wild felids. A range of calls that shift with mood, with threat, with a particular quality of a morning they decide they trust. Arya has none of that. She eats, she sleeps. She moves through her enclosure with the contained, deliberate movements of an animal that has decided the world does not require her participation. On Tuesday mornings, a young volunteer named Moira cleans the corridor outside Arya's enclosure. She works with headphones, in moving the mop in long strokes, and sometimes she whistles without noticing she's doing it. 3 weeks ago, she whistled a melody she learned from her grandmother. Arya made a sound. One sound small, low, not repeated. The keeper at the end of the corridor had worked at this park for 3 years. She had never heard Arya make any sound at all. She stood completely still and did not move for a long time after the sound stopped. To understand why Arya stopped making sounds, you have to go back 2 years to a different country, a different season, and a woman who had never intended to be part of this story at all. The earthquake struck the Rasht Valley in Tajikistan on the 14th of November at 4:17 in the morning. Magnitude 6.1. The temperature outside was -7. By 6 a.m., 3 villages in the valley had lost their outer walls, and the organization's field team was already on the road. Dr. Farideh Sadeghi was 44 years old, and she had been doing this long enough that she kept her field bag packed between deployments rather than unpacking and repacking it each time. She was a livestock veterinarian. Goats, cattle, the animals that mountain families needed alive to make it through winter. She was not a wildlife specialist. She had never been a wildlife specialist. She found Arya on the 3rd day in the rubble of a collapsed stone wall on the eastern edge of a village called Vanj. The wall had been part of an outbuilding, a storage space for feed and tools. The kind of structure that collapses completely in a 6.1 and leaves almost nothing intact. Arya was 14 days old. Her eyes had been open for perhaps 2 days. She was the size of a man's fist, gray-brown, and spotted pressed flat against a broken timber as though she had decided that becoming part of the wood was her best remaining option. There was no sign of the mother anywhere in a 200-meter radius. Farideh checked. She was thorough about that. The nearest wildlife rescue team was 340 kilometers away. The mountain road between here and there had been closed since the first aftershock. It was -9 by midday and dropping. Farideh was not trained for this. She knew that. She took off her wool scarf, wrapped it around the kitten in 3 careful layers, and put her in the inside pocket of her field jacket against her ribs. Then she went back to work on the cattle. That night in the canvas field tent, the team had set up at the edge of the village. Farideh sat with Arya in her lap and thought about what she had available. Goat's milk, diluted. A plastic dropper from the medical kit. Her own body heat. She started with those 3 things. Arya did not feed on the first attempt. She turned her face away from the dropper and pressed herself into the fold of Farideh's jacket and made a sound so small it was almost not a sound at all. On the second attempt, 20 minutes later, she turned away again. On the 3rd attempt, an aftershock moved through the valley. Not large, perhaps 3.2, enough to rattle the tent poles and send a ripple through the ground, and Arya went rigid in Farideh's hands. The rigidity was total. Every muscle locked. Her eyes, which had been half open, went wide and fixed. She did not make a sound. She simply stopped the way very small animals stop when they understand they are completely alone in the dark, and there is nothing to call to. Farideh held her and did not know what to do. Then she did the only thing she could think of. She sang. Not because she had read anything about the acoustic soothing of traumatized neonates. Not because she had a plan, because her grandmother used to sing it when Faraday was small and afraid in a house in Isfahan that always smelled of cardamom and old wool. And it was the only thing her body knew to do when something small and frightened needed the world to be less than it was. The song was called Lurak Lurak. It was a Persian lullaby, very old, the kind of melody that does not belong to anyone in particular, and therefore belongs to everyone. It began with 4 notes that descended, not a scale exactly, but a shape, a small falling shape that the voice made naturally without effort, the way water finds its level. Faraday sang those 4 notes over and over quietly in the dark of the tent, with the aftershock still settling in the ground beneath her. Arya did not relax immediately, but she stopped being rigid. That was enough for that night. Over the next 6 weeks, the feeding schedule was every 3 hours day and night. Faraday learned to sleep in the gaps between 90 minutes at a stretch. On the floor of the tent, her jacket rolled under her head, waking before the alarm, because her body learned to track the rhythm of it. Arya would not feed in silence. That became clear by the end of the first week. If the tent was quiet, she turned away from the dropper. If there were voices outside, or the sound of equipment, she locked. But if Faraday sang specifically, if Faraday sang those 4 descending notes, the opening of Lurak, Lurak repeated and repeated, Arya would settle within 30 to 40 seconds, and she would feed. It was not a strategy. It was just what worked. By the end of the 2nd week, Arya had begun to anticipate it. She would turn toward the sound before the dropper arrived. By the end of the 4th week, she was asleep within 90 seconds of Faraday beginning to sing a deep, boneless sleep, the weight of a small animal that has decided at the cellular level that the world is currently safe. By the end of the 6th week, Arya weighed 340 grams. She could eat from a flat dish. She could walk in a straight line without falling. She was by the criteria that mattered, ready to be transferred. The permit had been arranged through the organization's wildlife liaison. Highland Wildlife Park in Kingussy, Scotland, a conservation facility with an established Pallas cat program and the capacity to provide lifetime care. Animals rescued in disaster zones could not remain in temporary field care beyond 60 days. There was no one to appeal to about this. There was no exception written into the protocol for a 340-gram cat and a woman who had been sleeping on a tent floor to feed her every 3 hours. None of that made the morning easier. Faraday had been notified 3 weeks earlier, which meant she had known for 3 weeks and had not mentioned it to anyone on the team and had continued the feeding schedule and the songs without letting the knowledge of the end date change any of it. The transport crate arrived on a Thursday morning, carried in by a logistics volunteer who set it on the floor of the tent without understanding what he was handing over. Faraday lined it with a section of old wool blanket, hers cut from the corner, the part that had the most contact with her body over 6 weeks. She picked Arya up. She began to sing. The 4 descending notes quiet the way she always began. She got through the opening phrase and the first full repetition. Then she stopped. Not because she decided to stop. Her voice simply did not continue. She held Arya against her chest for a moment that she did not measure. Then she placed her in the crate on the wool and closed the latch. Arya looked up through the wire of the door. She was still. She was not making any sound at all. Faraday picked up her field bag and walked out of the tent. The logistics volunteer who had waited outside carried the crate to the vehicle. Faraday did not watch it go. She had 3 hours before the team moved to the Kunduz deployment, and she used them to finish her livestock assessment reports, sitting at the folding table in the corner of the operations tent, filling in columns of numbers with the same handwriting she always used. Highland Wildlife Park sits in the Cairngorms, in the kind of Scottish landscape that looks in November as though color has simply been removed from the world of brown hills, gray sky. The dark line of conifer plantations along the ridge. Arya arrived on a Thursday morning in a transport crate in the back of a veterinary vehicle. She was assessed, photographed, weighed, and assigned to the Pallas cat enclosure in the park's Northern Conservation Unit. The intake notes described her as healthy. Quiet on arrival, the keeper wrote likely transport stress. That was November. By January, the quiet had not changed. By March, the veterinary team had examined her twice more and found nothing. By June, 7 months in the behavioral log for Arya's enclosure contained a single repeated phrase in different handwriting. No vocalization observed. The head keeper for the northern unit was a man named Duncan Fraser. He was 51 years old, and he had been working with captive wild felids for 22 years, long enough to have developed the particular patience that the work requires. Not the performed patience of someone waiting for something to happen, but the real kind, the kind that has learned to find the situation interesting rather than frustrating. He tried recordings of Pallas cat calls from the Central Asian steppe. He tried scent enrichment from materials associated with natural prey. He tried adjusted feeding schedules, new substrates, novel objects placed at the enclosure boundary. Arya investigated the objects methodically and then returned to her preferred resting spot and sat with her back to the enclosure wall and her face toward nothing in particular. She was not distressed by any observable measure. She was not pacing, not self-grooming excessively, not refusing food. She was simply present in a way that kept some essential part of itself withheld. Duncan had worked with animals in deep behavioral withdrawal before. This was not quite that. It was something he did not have a name for, and he noted it carefully in the log, and he kept trying, and he did not find it. In the second year, the behavioral log entries became shorter. No vocalization observed. No vocalization observed. No vocalization observed. 730 days. On a Tuesday morning in October, a new volunteer arrived for her placement year. Her name was Moira Callahan. She was 23 years old in her final year of veterinary science at Edinburgh, and she had chosen Highland Wildlife Park for her practical placement because she was interested in conservation medicine and had read a paper by one of the staff vets that she thought was genuinely good. She had not been briefed specifically on Arya beyond the standard note, Pallas Cat Northern Unit, no direct contact. Her first week consisted mostly of enclosure cleaning, food preparation, and observation periods that she took seriously, keeping quiet and still and writing detailed notes in the small green notebook she carried in her jacket pocket. On Tuesday morning, she was assigned the corridor outside the felid enclosures, sweeping and mopping, a job she did alone because the morning keeper was on a veterinary call elsewhere. She worked from one end to the other methodically, with her earbuds in. At the far end of the corridor opposite Arya's enclosure, she ran the mop through a tight corner and found her hands doing the same small movement they always did when she was concentrating on something else. Her lips shaping a sound that was not quite a whistle. The 4 descending notes of a melody she had known since she was small. Her grandmother had sung it. Her grandmother was from Isfahan, and she had sung it the way people sing things that were sung to them without explanation, without context, because the melody was simply part of the furniture of a life. Moira did not know its name. She was not aware in that moment that she was doing it at all. Arya was at the back of her enclosure when it started. She was at the front within 4 seconds. Not running. Moving with the quick, deliberate purpose of an animal that has received information and is acting on it before the rest of the brain catches up. She stopped at the front wall and made a sound. Small. Low. Not a call that matched anything in the published Pallas cat behavioral literature. Something older than that and less formal. At the far end of the corridor, Sarah Okonkwo, who had been a keeper at Highland for 3 years and had never heard Arya make any sound, was transferring food from a preparation tray to a set of marked dishes. She set the tray down very carefully on the counter. She did not move. Moira finished the corridor, wound her earbuds around her hand, and began collecting her equipment. Sarah waited until she was done. Then she said in a voice she made deliberately casual, "That tune you were whistling. Where does it from?" Moira looked up. She thought about it. "Persian, I think," she said. "My gran used to sing it. Her mum was Iranian." Sarah looked at her for a moment. "Can you call her?" she said. "Today." Duncan arrived in the corridor 4 minutes after Sarah called him. He asked Moira to sing the melody again. She sang it unselfconsciously, standing in the corridor in her work boots, the 4 descending notes and the phrase that followed them. Duncan listened. He did not recognize it. He looked at Moira. "Do you know what it is?" he said. She shook her head. "Just something my gran sang." He asked her to call her mother. Moira's mother answered on the second ring, listened to Moira sing 4 notes over the phone, and said immediately, "That's something Gran sings, isn't it? Call her." Moira's grandmother was 79 years old and lived in Bristol, and answered her phone on the first ring because she always answered on the first ring. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's Lurak Lurak. Very old song, Persian lullaby. Where did you hear it, my love?" "Moira said you taught it to me, Gran." Her grandmother laughed, a sound like something remembered. "I suppose I did," she said. Duncan took the phone. He asked the grandmother to sing it from the beginning clearly, if she was willing. She was willing. She sang it twice slowly in the kitchen of her flat in Bristol. While Duncan held the phone up in a corridor in the Cairngorms, and Arya stood at the front of her enclosure and did not move. He recorded it. That evening, he opened Arya's intake file for the first time in 6 months. He read the rescue history section. The words were brief. Recovered Vanj village, Tajikistan, following earthquake event. Primary carer during field stabilization, Dr. Farideh Sadeghi, Livestock Emergency Veterinarian International Relief Organization. Duration of field care, 6 weeks. Transfer arranged under Wildlife Rehabilitation Protocol. Duncan read it twice. Then he closed the file and sat for a moment at his desk in the quiet of the office after hours, with the sound of the wind off the Cairngorms moving through the window frame. The following morning, he placed a small wireless speaker on the shelf outside Arya's enclosure and played the grandmother's recording at low volume. Arya was at the back of the enclosure. She raised her head. She stood. She crossed the enclosure in a series of the quick, definite movements that Pallas cats use when they have decided something, and she stopped in front of the speaker at a distance of perhaps 30 centimeters. She made a sound. She made it continuously for 7 minutes for the full length of the recording, and then she stopped when it stopped. Duncan replayed it. She made the sound again. He played it a 3rd time. When it finished the 3rd time, Arya sat down in front of the speaker and was still. Sarah was standing at the corridor entrance. Her hand was over her mouth. Moira was beside her, and she did not understand yet what she was looking at. But she understood that it was something because of the way Duncan was standing very still, facing the enclosure, holding the phone at his side instead of putting it away. He turned around after a while. He looked at both of them. He did not say anything. He went to his office and closed the door. 3 days later, Dr. Elspeth Graham arrived from the University of Edinburgh. She was a Felid behavioral researcher, and Duncan had worked with her before. He had sent her the recording of Arya with the speaker, and she had watched it 4 times before she replied to his email. She spent a morning with Arya and an afternoon with the data. In the evening, she sat across from Duncan in the park's small conference room. She said at 14 days old, a Pallas cat's brain is still building the structures that will tell it for the rest of its life what safety feels like. Whatever is present during those first weeks, consistently, repeatedly, in the moments when the animal is most afraid, gets written in at a level below habit, below training, below anything that a new place and 2 years of good care can reach. She paused. She looked at the data sheet in front of her and then set it aside. The 2 years of silence, she said, were not suppression. Arya had not stopped communicating. She simply had nothing in her environment that felt like the answer to the question she was asking. "I've worked with captive felids for 15 years, she said. I have never seen an animal wait that long. Duncan did not write anything in his notebook for the rest of that meeting. That night, Duncan sat at his desk for a long time, without turning the office light on. The park was quiet around him. The low sounds of animals settling the wind off the ridge, the particular silence of a building that has been full of people and is now empty. He opened his laptop. Duncan sent an email to the International Relief Organization that Friday. He addressed it to the General Welfare Inquiry address listed in Arya's file and marked it for the attention of Dr. Farideh Sadeghi if she was reachable. He kept it short. He explained what had happened with the recording and with the volunteer, and with Dr. Graham's assessment. He attached a 12-second clip of Arya vocalizing in front of the speaker. Then he sent it and did not know if it would reach anyone. 2 weeks passed. The reply came on a Thursday evening from a different email address than the one in the file, a personal address, not the organization's. It was 4 lines. It said, "I am in Bangladesh until the end of the month. Limited connectivity. Please tell me, is she healthy?" Duncan read it 3 times. He wrote back that evening. He wrote that Arya was healthy, that she was eating well, that she had been well cared for. He attached the same 12-second clip. At the bottom he typed, "When you have connectivity, I would like to call you." The call came on a Sunday night. Faraday was in a tent outside Dhaka, the kind of temporary operations base that relief organizations construct quickly and dismantle just as quickly, canvas walls, a folding table, a generator running somewhere outside. There was a headlamp clipped to the tent frame above her. Her face in the video window was tired, in the particular way of someone who has been tired for a long time and no longer thinks of it as a condition. Duncan explained what had happened. He explained the silence and the volunteer and the song and what Dr. Graham had said about associative safety maps. Faraday listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you play it to her now? Play what Duncan said." "The recording you sent me," she said, "while we're on the call." Duncan propped his phone against a notebook on the desk and crossed the office and opened the door to the corridor. He held the laptop so the camera could see the enclosure window at the far end. He played the 12-second clip. The sound from the laptop speaker was small in the room, the grandmother's voice slightly compressed by the recording, the 4 notes descending. From the enclosure at the end of the corridor in the dark, Arya made a sound. On the screen, Faraday's face changed. Not dramatically. The muscles around her eyes shifted, and she pressed her lips together, and she looked at something that was not the camera. Duncan waited. After a moment she said, "Does it work every time?" "Every time," Duncan said. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Can you put me on hold for a moment?" He did. When she came back, she said, "I have leave I haven't taken. 4 days. I could come in 3 weeks." Duncan said yes. That was the whole conversation. The flight from Dhaka took 17 hours a connection through Dubai, a long layover, in which Faraday sat in a bright airport and drank tea from a paper cup and did not sleep. And then the final leg north into Edinburgh in the early morning, the clouds below the plane breaking apart over the North Sea to show the first gray light on water. Duncan met her at arrivals. He was holding a paper sign with her name on it, which she said later was unnecessary, but which she also appreciated. They drove the 3 hours north into the Cairngorms, largely in silence. Not because either of them was uncomfortable, but because there was not much that needed to be said before the thing that needed to happen had happened. It was November again. The hills were the same brown they were every November, the sky the same particular Scottish gray that sits low and close. She looked out the window at it for a long time. They arrived at the park in the late afternoon when the light was already going. Duncan showed Faraday to the staff accommodation and told her that the approach to the enclosure would happen in the morning when Arya was most active. He said, "I want you to understand that she may not respond. 2 years is a long time. She may not have the olfactory access to you. She may recognize the sound, but not connect it to a person." Faraday said, "I understand." She said it the way someone says it when they have considered the possibility and decided it does not change what they are going to do. She did not sleep much that night, not because she was anxious about Arya, because a field team in Cox's Bazar was working a flooding situation without her, and she lay in the narrow bed in the staff accommodation and ran the logistics of the deployment in her head, the way she always did when she was away from a site. At 6:45 in the morning, Duncan came to the accommodation with 2 cups of tea in a carrier. They walked to the northern unit together, in the dark, their breath visible in the cold air. The conifers along the ridge still and black against a sky that had just begun to consider light. The corridor outside the field enclosures was empty at that hour. Arya was active at first light. Duncan had watched her on the night camera, and she had been moving through the enclosure since 5 a.m. The long, low pacing of an animal that was alert and present and waiting, though not for anything it could have named. Duncan stopped Faraday at the entrance to the corridor. He said, "Just walk normally. Don't call her. Don't make any sound toward her. Let her do whatever she does." Faraday nodded. She set her tea down on the window ledge near the door. She walked into the corridor. The corridor was perhaps 20 meters long. She was at 15 meters when Arya made a sound. Not when she came into view. Not when she reached the enclosure. At 15 meters, while the angle of the door frame still blocked the line of sight completely, Arya was already at the front of her enclosure and already vocalizing the same sound as the recording, small and low and continuous, but louder now, without the compression of a speaker, filling the corridor with something that was not quite like anything Duncan had heard from her or from any other animal in this space. Faraday stopped. She was standing at perhaps 12 meters, and she stopped and put one hand on the wall beside her, and stood there for a moment that was not short. She was not crying. She was simply very still. Duncan at the corridor entrance had stopped writing in his notebook. He looked at the floor. After a moment, Faraday walked the rest of the way. She sat down on the floor in front of the enclosure, not slowly, not deliberately, just sat. The way a person sits when standing is no longer the right thing to be doing. Arya was at the front wall, her face against the mesh, making the sound. Faraday did not touch the mesh. She did not sing. She simply sat in her field jacket with the worn cuffs on the concrete floor of the corridor 3 centimeters from the wire, and Arya pressed her forehead into the mesh and was close to her, and the sound continued for a long time. Duncan walked back to his office. He had work to do, and he did it. He told Moira when she arrived for her shift at 8 that the corridor outside the Pallas cat enclosure should be left clear for the morning. Moira asked why, and he said he would explain later, and he did explain later carefully and in full. And she listened with the green notebook open on the table in front of her and did not write anything in it. Faraday had 4 days. She spent them at the enclosure in the mornings, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, reading field reports on her laptop or simply sitting. Arya was in the front of the enclosure during those mornings, consistently. Not always at the mesh, not always vocalizing, but present and oriented in the way that animals are oriented toward things they have decided matter. On the 2nd day, she sat close enough to the mesh that her whiskers touched it. On the 3rd day, she fell asleep there on the concrete 3 centimeters from the wall, while Faraday was reading a flood logistics report on the other side. On the morning of the 4th day, her last morning, the car to Edinburgh leaving at noon, Faraday arrived at the corridor at first light before Duncan. She sat on the floor. She waited until Arya had settled at the front of the enclosure. Then she began to sing. Not the 4 notes only. The whole song from the beginning, all the way through the shape of it that she had not sung in full since the tent in Tajikistan. She sang it at normal volume, without hesitation, in the empty corridor with the Scottish morning light coming in through the window at the end. She sang it through once, and then once more. When she stopped, the corridor was quiet. Then Arya made a sound. 4 notes, descending. The opening phrase of the melody sung back in a voice that was not a human voice, but held the shape of it, the same interval, the same fall, recognizable the way a reflection is recognizable, imperfect, and precise at once. Then silence. Faraday sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not move. Duncan was at the entrance to the corridor. He had arrived in time to hear it. He stood there with his notebook at his side and did not open it. At noon, Faraday collected her bag from the accommodation. She shook Duncan's hand at the car park. She said, "Thank you for finding me." He said, "Thank you for coming." She got into the car, and it drove south toward Edinburgh, and she did not look back, which was not because she didn't want to, but because looking back had never been the thing that helped. She had a connecting flight in the morning, a team waiting. Work that continued regardless of what had happened here, as it always did. Arya did not vocalize when the car left. She was at the back of the enclosure in her preferred resting spot, with her face turned toward the wall. The following morning, at 6:49, before Duncan unlocked the door to the northern unit corridor before any keeper had entered the building, Arya made a sound. 4 notes. Descending. Duncan heard it through the door with his key in the lock. He stood there for a moment without turning it. He turned it. He walked to the enclosure. Arya was at the front wall. She made the sound once more when she saw him, and then was quiet. He stood there with his hands in his pockets for a while, in the early morning, in the particular stillness of the place, before the day had started. Then he went to get her food. She made the sound the next morning, too. And the morning after that. Not for him, not for the corridor, for the beginning of the day, before anyone arrived. As if she was marking the fact of it. As if she was making sure it got counted. Duncan noted it in the log each time, in the same handwriting, in the same careful columns. 4-note vocalization, pre-staff entry. No external stimulus identified. He filed the entry. He closed the notebook. He stood for a moment, in the quiet of the early morning, in a corridor in the Scottish Highlands, listening to the sound of an animal that had waited 2 years for something it could not explain, and had found it, and had found a way to keep it. Then he went about his work.